Well, thank you and coming in today and coming to talk about hot sauce.
Yeah.
You're a man that loves chili sauce.
I am indeed.
Yeah, and come make me sweat and cry.
make the tears flow.
This production was recorded at the podcast studios in the Media Arts Centre at Murdoch University. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Murdoch University. Any content provided by the hosts and guests are their personal opinions and are not intended to represent the views or opinions of the university, its administration, faculty, or staff. Now we have that out of the way, let's talk science. Paramount importance.
No, we're not talking about chili sauce. It's come to talk about fire, fire ecology. How can you describe that topic? Like, what is fire management or fire ecology?
Well, I think it's useful to say that when we live in this world, we know that the world is a dynamic place. It varies, and fire is one of those things that is dynamic. It's a process, and it changes the world around us, but it also is part and parcel of how the world works. But if you think of fire like something that can flow across the landscape, like a fluid, we have put a bunch of static things like houses and towers and all the rest of the infrastructure in that landscape. And so now we're in a position where we have to do something about how we're going to interact with fire so that our stuff doesn't burn down or we don't lose lives or other values.
Right. Yeah, I've never thought of it like that. Like, because, back in history, everyone moved around. So fire, everything was in this, flow state. Now,
that's right.
That's a good way of putting it. I've never thought of it like that. So when we've got obviously a lot of fragmented bushland, especially in Australia, you've got to manage it in certain ways obviously it's got to be, as you said, not get to a level that it can impact the infrastructure that we have built. Why is it, though, important for Australian bushland?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we know that, we've had humans in Australia for 50,000 years, and we know humans used fire as a management tool. And they did that in a landscape that they both altered and also purposely put fire into to promote certain plants or certain animals or certain locations where they could hunt more readily. And as that's gone on and on, that means that the plants and animals are somewhat fire dependent because they've evolved to live with fire. And the absence of fire sometimes is detrimental. And in modern times, where, as you were saying, we've fragmented the landscape, and that means, again, if you think of fire like a fluid, when you put fragments in, when you put barriers in, it stops it. And some places that might have burned in the past are now cut off, and they're not going to burn. And so some of those places, the only way they're going to have fire is through human hands. And so it's important to put fire into some of those places. And in other contexts, we have too much fire because we have too many people. And we know that there's a lot of people who are accidentally start fires or on purpose, then they can have detrimental effects. So to answer your question, fire is an essential process. A lot of organisms are fire dependent or benefit from it somehow. But at the same time, it's a little bit of a Goldilocks principle of, relative to the past, where do we have too much or too little?
Right. You said that like some of the plants have evolved to fire. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, great. So a lot of plants and animals, but plants in particular, have the ability to either resprout after fire, or they have specialized traits with their seeds that they're triggered to germinate after fire or to be released after fire. And we interpret that as an adaptation, a trait that has evolved in response to repeated disturbance and is adaptive. It gives the plants an evolutionary advantage through natural selection. They have more offspring if they they have that ability to resprout, or they have the seeds that are specialized to come in after fire and germinate. And so those traits mean that the plants do better in particular frequencies or styles of fire than other species.
Right. What do you mean by a frequencies is like the number of times of fire, and then some you said intensity of fire.
That's right. That's right. So a lot of time when we think about fire, we tend to try to frame it in terms of what has come in the past. And we often put that in terms of how often, when fire did occur, how intense was it, how hot, how much what was the thermal intensity of that, what season might the fire have occurred in, and what sort of size or spatial pattern did that fire occur in. So like, was it really big or was it small? Was it patchy? That type of idea. And so those types of ideas help us describe what we call a fire regime. And as fire ecologists and fire managers, it's often that idea of a fire regime that we're sort of evaluating current conditions relative to, and then making decisions about whether a location needs more or less fire.
Right. So what are some of these decisions? So obviously you're going to be based on time of year. So some different plants when they go into seed or when they're requiring fire to go into seed, are they all at the sort of the same time of year, or is it different times of the year that they require fire? Or
Yeah. So when we think about the seasonality of fire, so fire, say in spring or autumn or summer, it's going to act it's going to act as a filter on species in different ways. So for example, if you're a plant that can resprout and you get burned during a period when you're actively growing, you may be able to resprout relatively easily because there's water in the soil. You might be able to replace that relatively quickly. If a seed at the same time of year might have required an extended period of sort of cool, wet conditions to go through the process of germination, putting on initial leaves, putting the roots down before it was then exposed to, say, a long, hot, dry summer. And so a spring fire, for example, for a seed could be quite detrimental. Whereas in the flip of that is a fire in the autumn, going into winter when it might be cool and wet and no fire, a seed might profit, but a plant that's been just come through the summer and has probably exhausted a lot of its resources and then it's burned might not have the reserves to completely resprout, depending on how stressful the summer was. And so that can cause issues. And it might more of those plants that have put their eggs in the basket of I'm a resprouter might not do as well. But it's not a black and white scenario necessarily. So you have a bit of a mix. And it's that relative mix and how that interacts with different species that creates the complexity that annoys people when ecologists say it all depends.
Yeah.
But also gives us the diversity that we have.
Right. So, yeah, I always thought, I obviously don't know too much about fire ecology, but growing up on the farm and, I just did burn-offs with my uncle and my granddad and gran for many years. We burnt at different times, well, usually sort of the same time around the year, but not knowing if that was the best time or not. For them, it was the best time to clear, the bushland. For them, they probably weren't thinking too much about the plants at the time.
Yeah.
But you're saying, so spring could be bad, autumn can be bad, but there's no definition, there's no right season for burning.
Well, that's a really interesting question, Kurt. I think the answer to that question depends on what you're trying to achieve. So, for example, I have the absolute pleasure to get to work with one of the PhD students I work with. Also works with our indigenous elders on the South Coast. And one of the things that she's done is she's gone out every 3 weeks for 14 months with an elder. And they've walked the same location. And she's asked those elders, is this an okay time to burn? And what are the things you're noticing? So they've looked at different plants, different places, and she's kind of put that all together. And the key time that the elders would say that it's okay to burn is in the autumn. After the first rains, when probably the fire, if you burn, it won't get out of control, but before stuff has started growing. And
Mm.
so that's the time of year when Nuar on the south coast would choose to burn. That's was a relatively defined window that would not have negative impacts on plants that would be important for food or spiritually or culturally. And that's pretty clear to them. Now, if you, the answer I was sort of giving that was more ecological, yeah, it could be a mixed bag. So from a farm management point of view, when you might burn on your land, you wouldn't want to do it the same every time because you'd be putting your fingers on the scales for the same set of species every single time. But if you mixed it up, you might get a little bit of back and forth, and that might be sensible. And it might depend on the particular year about how dry or warm it was, that sort of issue. On the farm, you might have been doing it for a fire management, like a bushfire risk point of view. And if you're doing it that way, probably your number one concern is that I don't want anything to get out of control when I light this up.
Mm.
And you're probably then going to work in what we would call the shoulder seasons in spring and autumn when it's not too hot, not too dry. And you might do it in the autumn after the first rains, just like the Nuar do. Or you might do it in the spring as you're kind of drying down a little bit, but the soil's still wet and you're confident you're not going to have a problem on your hands. And you're achieving that risk reduction, but without any other risk of it escaping. And so in that case, the biodiversity side might be a relatively secondary consideration.
Mm. So there's different species that will prefer different times of year. So there's no so I'm just wrapping my head around this black and white because from what you're saying, the Noongar people, that sounds pretty black and white. Like, first rains in autumn, go burning. But that could also not mean for the best situation for every species.
Yeah, or in particular years, you might not burn. So
would they know that? Or are they still figuring that part out?
I think they probably do know that.
Right.
I think it's, for example, I had a fascinating discussion with an elder a year ago, say, and he made the point to me, sometimes the Nuar calendar has seasons in it that are defined by certain events, morning dew, certain plants flowering, certain animals showing up or going away.
Mm.
That doesn't necessarily operate on a 12-month cycle, or even certain years, certain seasons don't occur. And if that season doesn't occur, the activities that you would undertake during that season just might not happen that year. So, for example, that might include burning, or you might do a lot less, for example.
Right. Western culture is very regimented, but that sounds very fluid. Like it sounds like a way, makes probably managing a lot easier because if there's no activity that you're not putting the pressure on the whatever thing that activity that was putting pressure on because it's not there for that year. So you're saving it for future future resources or whatever it is.
That's right. I think effectively, in a way, you're talking about reading country.
Yeah.
In a particular year, if a particular set of conditions present themselves, you respond to that. You can be dynamic in how you deal and what your plan is. And I think when I talked to that Noongar elder, when he told me that, it blew my mind. I was like, oh, how can you not be on a 12-month schedule? Of course you would have to be. But when I stopped to think about it, I was like, well, of course you're right. And when you turn that around and you think about fire or fire management and all this stuff that we have that's channeled through government and, as citizens, we expect to be protected and we expect, quote unquote, management to occur. I think it's very difficult for government to step back and respond to that sort of dynamism of a particular year because they work on a 12-month budget and they work in a very regimented way because it's a bureaucracy. And that's the societal expectation, but it makes it really hard to respond to that, to environmental variation.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely would be. Like, just quickly going back to the fluidity of the seasons in the Noongar culture. Like definitely see that when a lot of the fish work that we do throughout estuaries, like going in like some estuaries that we've done continual annual monitoring. Like you see some years are completely different to other years. So it depends on when you're there, and like making that would make so much sense. Like, if we've sampled this estuary in this year, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be like that the next year or following year. And like, you can't manage it thinking that, oh, this is how this estuary is. And then if you go back there, it's like, oh my God, what's changed? Why is it so different? But there's obviously those reasons. That's in terms of fire management though, you said, because going back to the very start, you're saying now we've got this infrastructure that's it's there. It doesn't move. This fluidity. How does this fire management work with that? Where does like burn offs? How does it all work in play with each other? Or like how? I can imagine this is a very complex.
Yes. For non-Australian listeners, they might not appreciate this, but it's what we might call a dog's breakfast at times.
Yeah.
It's messy. It can be really messy. And that's no one individual's fault. It is an emergent property of a lot of people trying to be in the space and do stuff. So how does government deal with this? Well, they go through formal processes of trying to identify what risk is, like how much at risk is a particular home of burning down, for example, or how vulnerable is a particular place to fire. And then they set conditions, or try to broadly set conditions for how often should we do fuel reduction burning, or what sort of materials should new buildings be constructed from to reduce the risk of structure loss? What sort of firefighting infrastructure do we need to put in place to reduce the risk to life? Like what's our response time going to be? Here in Perth, we have our hills on the east side of town where there's forest and sort of scattered low density places, and there's still pressure to put in new housing developments. And one of the big issues around that is, what are we going to do about the bushfire risk? Are we going to have one road in and one road out? That seems a little bit dodgy at times. So how do we deal with that risk, and how do we interface with fire? There's a lot of different answers to that. There's the stuff I just spoke about. There's educating the population, which is often, urban refugees who may not completely be across that type of stuff. So there's a lot of different layers to it.
Yeah, definitely. Do you know there's much collaboration with the Noongar fluidity of management in fire? Is it like working towards that space now, or is it still?
Yeah, so it's a mixed bag, which is not a surprising answer. I will say, for example, we here in Perth in our southern hemisphere summer of 23-24, it was an incredibly long, hot, dry summer. And by the end of that, there was a lot of signs up and down our west coast of vegetation stress. And
what are those signs?
Like plants had turned brown and they were dying back, and just things looked like crap. And our primary fire risk agency who manages natural places, the Biodiversity Agency, basically put a lot of its prescribed burning program on hold for the autumn, which I think was a fantastic decision. And that showed definite response to actual conditions, but that's rare. And it's difficult for them to do that often, but the size of the event demanded it. Now, in terms of working with Indigenous peoples and trying to incorporate some of those visions of how fire is put in the landscape, how often, the style, there's a lot of detail in that. And state government still has a long ways to go there. But there are signs of, like, for example, we do have some what we call it cultural burning broadly. And that is occurring on private land. It's occurring on some local government lands. And that knowledge, I think, is slowly building. And over time, I would be hopeful that that can find its way into more broad application. But we have to be absolutely clear that cultural burning or nuar, traditional burning is not going to necessarily save us from ourselves when it comes to bushfire risk or climate change impacts or any of that sort of stuff. We're still going to have to deal with the fact that we've put these sort of static structures in the landscape, and there are more, and we also have introduced weeds, we've changed the landscape. There's all manner of changes that we've put in where more white fella fire is probably going to still be required, or it's just not going to be as amenable to traditional or cultural burning.
Right.
So we're going to, but that's the way forward. We're going to have to figure that out as we go.
Yeah. What's white fella burning? Like, is it, well, I kind of briefly know because being on the farm, it's like there's airplanes that come and drop mini bombs and can smother a whole area, which I know down in the southwest near where I grew up was like there was an impact of like the native fauna because they've just smothered a whole area of fire that didn't really allow for native fauna to move out because it's just, in a way, you could say it's dropped a bomb on top of them. Like that doesn't seem the best idea.
Yeah. So I would say the standard operating procedure for conducting prescribed burning at the moment in Western Australia is one where we have what's called an area-based target. And so the idea is that a certain percent of the landscape has been burnt recently. And by achieving that percent, you therefore reduce the overall or sort of risk at the landscape level of a big bushfire tearing across the landscape and then burning down a town or something like that. To achieve that target, that requires something on the order of about 200,000 hectares or 500,000 acres per year to be burned by our land management agencies. In order to achieve that target, they have to burn large areas at a time. To burn a large area at a time requires a particular style that is sort of what you were describing. So it basically involves choosing an area that's, say, between 2,000 and it could be upwards of 10,000 hectares at a time, making the edge black, so putting in a boundary, and then at some point using an airplane or a helicopter to drop incendiaries out in a pattern and then igniting that and then turning the majority of it black. There are downsides to that approach, and nothing is ever absolute. There's always opportunity to improve, and I think I'm hopeful that some newer tools can come into play that would actually help create a more patchy outcome.
Do you know any of these new tools or some ideas?
Well, for example, what we're basically talking about is since particularly the 1950s in Western Australia, after World War II, when a lot of surplus airplanes came back from the war, those planes were then turned to fire. And so basically it became a tool to drop incendiaries in a pattern over a large area, ignite it, and then that was very effective. Problem with that is that you're flying an airplane at a certain speed and you sort of got a little machine that you set to drop them every so many seconds, which is a certain spacing. So it's a regular grid because it's just what the tech can do. Nowadays, you could use a drone. And for example, you can pre-program a drone to drop incendiaries in a particular pattern. It doesn't have to be a grid. And using an airplane it's a very human thing. People emotionally are always afraid that they're not putting enough fire in because they want to get it to take and to spread. And that often pushes you a little past the edge. And then you really it gets a little more active than you might have wanted otherwise, a little hotter. Using a drone, you pre-program it and you can work with the topography. So if you have certain areas you want to protect, leave unburnt, some areas you want to let the fire sort of creep up the hillside, you could program that into a drone and you could do it a little more steady. and it's probably cheaper as well because you don't need like a pilot and a person riding in the airplane.
Fuel, just
The
run
fuel,
yeah.
all of that sort of stuff. There's opportunities there to probably save on cost as well as put some more complexity into these places that would probably be, it would enable a new level of ecological sensitivity and cultural sensitivity as well. A lot of times cultural sites get burnt in these large burns as well. So.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. I hope that does. It sounds like it's moving into that way and make the more viable, best solution. Is there? So you briefly touched on like fire intensity. So obviously, it's the fuel load that's in the ground, which goes back to how long, I guess, since that area has been burnt and how much fuel's there. Like fires can get too hot, can't they? And they can then incinerate the seeds. Like, how can you explain more about the intensity type? Well, you talked about the types of fire.
Yep.
I guess so. We'll probably start with the types of fire and then how that works with different plants.
Yeah, absolutely. So fire is a process. Many of us have sat around a campfire and we start a fire in the fireplace, and you know that it takes building it up, and it's a chain reaction, and you have to sort of get it going. And we also know that when you watch the flames coming out of the wood, curiously, the flames aren't touching the wood, right? They're a little bit above. And that's because it's heating, and it's heating that's causing gases to come out. And then that's what's igniting to cause the actual flame. And then later we see the glowing coals, and that's a different type of combustion, what we call glowing combustion. And all of that is a process. It's all different types of combustion. And just as we understand intuitively, wet wood doesn't burn very well. And so when we talk about intensity, it is a measure of how much heat is being emitted. And that is as an outcome of how much biomass is available, what type it is. Is it a bunch of like small stuff? And how moist, what we call availability, how wet it is. The drier it is, the more quote unquote available it is. And so when you run fire through like leaf litter and grass or something, it'll move very quickly and it'll burn very quickly. If you have larger pieces of wood and logs and that sort of stuff, it'll stick around much longer, and it'll be hotter because it'll stick around.
We've seen fires on the farm, like even hay bales, they burn for months.
Yeah.
Like we've gone out like after they've done a burn off through the bush and all that, and you go down and it's just like you dig up where the base of the tree was and it's just going down the roots. And this is like months later and it's still going. Yeah. Like that.
It's crazy, isn't it?
It's insane. It's like unfathomable when you see it and you're like, what? Yeah.
And so, here in our state, we have fire management is not without controversy. And so a lot of large trees, kind of what you just described, they can be vulnerable to being damaged at the base by fire, and then they can burn for months. If the fire gets into the main stem, the trunk, it can burn up or it can burn down into the roots. And eventually, if it undermines enough of that structure of the tree will fall over. And then you oftentimes lose the largest trees in the forest that way. And that can be really problematic. And so burning, if you're going to be a person who manages fire and you put fire in on purpose, that's one of the risks you have to navigate. It's not just burning the little bits and pieces down. It's also a risk of losing your large trees in the forest and balancing that stuff out.
So going back to intensity, so sometimes it can be too hot for like the seeds, right? Because I've seen you on camp. Camp is I'm referring to as a unit that I demonstrate with Joe down when we go, and I've seen you like, I like to say it, smoking cones or like burning cones and all that. So like, and sort of shows that, well, these are the adaptations that plants have done to open up when there's fire or smoke. But sometimes it can get too hot. I'm going to ask two questions in one. What are some of the more interesting adaptations you've seen for plants that have adapted to fire? And then what is the level of intensity where you can see like what types of fire or fires that we've seen that have been just too hot and just Well, can it wipe out the whole bush where that doesn't recover, or is there always going to be some bits of recovery?
So when you go into a forest after a bushfire, sometimes you see stuff that looks like the chalk outline from a murder scene, where there's just white ash in a line or a couple lines, and that's where a log has burnt out. And sometimes the soil there's like a pile of a little line of white ash, and then the soil is pink around it and super fluffy. And that is where a log has sat and burned for days or weeks, and it's put so much heat into the soil that it's effectively definitely killed all the seeds. Any plants that were in that area that might have resprouted, they're gone. And even the fungi and some of the microorganisms have been totally removed from that soil. And you can come back years later sometimes, and you can still see those spaces are not really occupied by plants. And so the effect of that can be massive.
I did a podcast with Anish a few weeks ago talking about the microbiomes in soil and how that grows with plants. Like that's the connection that there's like everything, has this connection from one thing to the next. But sorry, I won't interrupt.
Yeah. Great. And so that's the extreme example. But what we also know is that soil is a fantastic insulator. So the amount of heat on the soil surface from something burning, it goes down as that sort of radiative heat transfer works into the soil. It declines very quickly. It's exponentially declining. It sticks around a little longer once the soil is hot. But so right on the soil surface, you would lose a lot of seeds, for example, that would suffer mortality. But a lot of seeds are maybe a centimeter down, and so they might not suffer a terrible fate. And then you can imagine in the forest, it's patchy. There'll be open areas where it's a little bit of bare ground. Some areas will be a really deep leaf litter. Other areas might be under a shrub, and then other areas might be underneath a log. And so in some places, the amount of heat that goes into that soil might be not too bad. In other places, it might be quite extreme. And so in the same way, seeds have varying amounts of tolerance. So some plants are quite sensitive to and even a little bit of heat, and some plants are quite tolerant of quite a bit of heat.
There wouldn't be too many Australian plants that are sensitive to heat, is there?
No, in fact, one of my colleagues, Ryan Tangy, who works for DBCA, our biodiversity department, did an experiment where he buried different species of seeds at different depths, and then he burned on top. And he found that actually a lot of the weeds are much more sensitive than our native plants.
Oh, it's a good way for control of,
So it points away that intense fire, to a point, actually might act as a cleansing agent in some of our places where there's weeds. It's tricky, though, because a lot of the weeds are the worst in our bushlands in the urban area. And that's where you're actually trying to achieve probably the lowest intensities, because you have a lot of people around who don't want a lot of smoke, or they're quite worried about big flames. Understandably.
Yes. Yeah. So we're touching base on like what a seed bank is.
Yep.
And is it the heat that triggers these plants to go to sprout, or is it smoke? Because it's smoke as well, isn't it? For say bankers.
That's right.
Yeah.
So one of the here we are. We're sitting here in this studio in the southwest corner of Australia on the Indian Ocean, and isolated. And not everybody thinks about WA all the time. But what we have learned in this place about how seeds work and how fire interacts with seeds is instructive for the world. And some of the big discoveries have been made here about germination. So it was here that we discovered that smoke causes seeds to germinate. And so it's for some species, like some of our legumes, we call those quote unquote hard seeded. They do require heat to sort of crack the seed coat and then germinate. But for a huge swathe of our species and many plants around the world,
what are some of these species
that require
smoke?
That require smoke. So our things in the in the blueberry family, for example. We have other things called trigger plants, which are cute little flowers. Heaps of other sort of some of our annuals, our daisies, also require smoke. So our little asters and stuff. And yeah, a whole raft of other things. No, generally like native plants that are small and sometimes annual, but also a lot of the perennial ones as well. And so a little bit of smoke that touches the outside of the seed causes that a reaction. Basically, it locks the carotenoid molecule touches the seed coat, and it causes an activation, a change of the seed's state, and then it begins to absorb water, and then if the conditions are right, it'll germinate.
Whoa.
Yeah.
So can you artificially create smoke for these plants?
Yes.
You can?
Yep. So It's basically like bong water.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah. So cool.
Yeah. And we also, another lovely person I had the luck to work with, Ebony Cowan, who now finished her PhD. She was working in rehabilitation. And so we wanted to understand, is there any way that you could boost the rehabilitation outcomes? And so she used a tool that some of our colleagues had shown her, where you have a drum, start a fire in that. You have a little hole in the side of the drum with like a tube and a little fan that you hook up to a car battery. And then you set a little tent up and you start your fire, and then the fan blows the smoke through the tube and into like the plastic tent, and it basically smokes the soil underneath the tent. And it worked a treat. It was a phenomenal germination response.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really great. It was really cool.
How big can you expand something like that?
We used sort of 1 meter by 5 meter tents. So, pretty, not huge.
You're definitely giving a certain type of person some ideas.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. But so 1 by 5 meter size tents. Yeah. And can you expand it bigger? Because even in terms of rehabilitating an area, that's still relatively pretty small.
Oh, it is relatively small. I think the scale up would be to say, if you have a site where you are really keen on germinating more seeds, you could gather up a bunch of leaf litter or even straw and set that out and then just burn it in a relatively quick. So it wouldn't produce a lot of heat necessarily, but it would create the smoke and a little bit of ash, and then you'd probably get that type of outcome.
Right. Going back to what you just read briefly about before, was there's been a lot of other discoveries in Southwest. What are some of the other ones? Or was it mainly the smoke? Because that's obviously a huge one.
Yeah, I think the smoke is a big one, but also a lot of sort of research over the years about understanding how plant nutrition works, because we also are in a corner of the planet where our soils are very old and nutrient depauperate. They're very low in their nutrient concentrations. And so understanding how plants have evolved all these adaptations to extract as much nitrogen, phosphorus as they can from the soil, like growing extra types of roots, and as well as using mycorrhizae and stuff to get those nutrients. I think that a lot of work's been done here. Understanding a lot of the sort of complex interactions with fire. I think we understand a lot of understanding of how to do fire and fire management. There's global lessons that can be taken from here. We do a lot of prescribed burning here that is not done else in many other places on the planet.
Is that something that's happened with the Los Angeles fires? That's one of the biggest fires that's definitely been in recent histories. What are some of the causes of that, and what are some of the lessons that we can learn from that?
Yeah. So the Los Angeles fires, I'll just say, I happened to be in California and I left about 30 hours before those fires started. And I drove on my way to the airport in Los Angeles. I drove past some of the places that burned like 2 days later. So it was
really
a little bit personally like
Yeah.
freaky. But no, the LA is really similar to WA in the sense that it's a Mediterranean climate. So that means we have, cool, wet winters, long, dry summers. And in 23, 24 in Perth, we had suffered a really hot, long, dry summer. And in the autumn, we saw a lot of really stressed, brown, dry, fire, like very risky, from a fire risk point of view, vegetation. But we had a few fires that were worrisome. But WA, or our region, only has 2 million people, whereas the Los Angeles itself is something probably like 12 million or some stupidly large number, relatively speaking. When those fires started in LA, they had a really long, dry summer, and the autumn had been really long and dry, just like we had in Perth. And then these fires started, and there were big winds, and there was nothing that they could do. So no amount of prescribed burning was would have saved them from what happened, because the wind, the intensity of the wind, it was like 100 kilometers an hour, or actually it was more than that.
Did that get increased because of the fire? Or was it like, if there was no fire, would have been?
The winds would have gone that high regardless of the fire.
Okay.
But what happens in the sort of micro stuff is fire can create its own weather. But no, these fires started, and the winds were moving down slope off the mountains and into these suburbs that were set at the bottom of the hills. And once the fires got into these suburbs, the gardens and houses started catching on fire. And at that stage, there was no amount of management in the sort of native vegetation that was uphill would have made much of a difference, I don't think. There's two really important differences between, say, Western Australia and Los Angeles is, one is the topography. So here we're relatively flat, and in LA it's quite steep. And so that makes the winds more extreme. The easterly, they were an easterly, just like we often get in Perth, but much more intense. Another really important difference is how we construct homes. So in North America in general, most homes are constructed from wood. And here in Perth, we have mostly brick construction. That doesn't mean that the homes here are not flammable, but it does mean that there's generally less wood in the homes, except in the trusses that hold up the roof. So that does help to some degree. But in both cases, in terms of lessons we can take from it, is under those conditions, it comes down to being prepared, having some level of risk management or risk agency, like a emergency response capacity, and also vegetation management around homes to deal with that. So overhanging, palm trees or other things that are quite flammable overhanging the home, roofs or gutters that are full of leaf litter and that sort of stuff. You just have to. That's something that needs to be maintained, and that's down to homeowner education. So that's sometimes doesn't feel as tangible, and it's a harder box to tick sometimes, but it is crucial.
I've definitely noticed around quite of my family, few of my family's members, they all have houses that are in bushland, and they've all cleared a long way, especially on the farm. Like we had so many big white gums and other trees around, and they've all been removed because of the fire safety. So it's like an educational process. So that's more of the lessons that we can learn from here, from those type of fires. Because interesting that you said that there was no fire management prevention that could have stopped those fires beforehand. Yep. Is there a certain amount of time that you can in Australia? How long should it be before a fire should go between a place? Or is it is there a best case scenario? It's each 1, 2, 3, 5 years. I know in some cases, I think it was, better not say a stat that I'm not sure about, but certain fires I can think it was 25 years before that area was burnt. That's a lot of fuel load over 25 years. Is there a best like amount of times it should be burnt in?
It's a great question, and it's a $60 million question that
Right.
a lot of people would love to have the answer to.
Mm.
So I'll start from LA and then work to answering your question. So the reason I said that about Los Angeles is because most of the vegetation surrounding Los Angeles is shrubland. It's heath. It's not forested. And those types of plants typically burn in what we call a stand replacing way. Fire goes through it, it burns. It's a sort of burns or it doesn't burn type of scenario. And in that part of the world, if you burn or clear too much, you have a negative impact on the plants and you get a lot of weeds and you get grassy weeds, which will then burn even more often. So there's not a lot to be gained from prescribed burning in that type of shrubland, particularly around Los Angeles because it's very arid. It's only 300 or 400 mils, maybe 500 mils of rain per annum, which would be more equivalent to our Midwestern region, not Perth, which is like 800 mils of rain. Now, to your question about what is the right interval, well, that's where it's really valuable, in my opinion. It's a little bit self-serving potentially, but is fuel, the stuff that combusts, is made of plants. And plants have ecology. They grow in certain ways. They live for certain periods of time. They have different shapes and configurations. And if we understand that, that can feed into what the appropriate management could be. And this gets to this idea of the fire regime, because part of that is how often do we think fire occurred? And that is often an outcome of how did the plants grow? When do they mature? When are they, quote unquote, ready to burn? When can they, how often should fire be if you want plants to replace themselves? They've had enough time to make seeds and all that sort of stuff. So in our shrublands, the answer might be anywhere from 12 to 50 years, depending on where you are. So for example, we have in our Midwest, it could be 12 to 20 years, say. On our South Coast, where fire was probably a little bit less frequent because of summer, it was a little cool. It's a little cooler in the summer. And we have things like very strange, cool endemic species like potaroos and scrub birds. We know that more frequent fire is quite negative for them. So that the places down there, the same might look roughly similar to our Midwest, but it's more like probably 20, 30, 40, 50 year intervals. And then when you get to places like our forests, which have much deeper litter layer, there's maybe multiple layers of vegetation. Well, there are multiple layers of vegetation. You might be talking about something entirely different where it's 8 to 12 years. And then if you go to the tropics, it might be every 2 years. And so there's a very intimate relationship between the ecosystem and what is the quote unquote sort of optimal frequency of fire.
Can you tell how long it's been since a fire's gone through a place?
I think I can.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's one of the things I love about what I do is like go into a place and trying to like Sherlock Holmes it, in terms of like, well, how tall is that? Oh, here's a Banksy. I can count the growth nodes.
Growth nodes.
Yeah. Like each year, when a plant's growing, when it stops growing in this early summer and sort of holds on until the next time it's cool and wet and happy, it puts on sort of like a little terminal mark, like the stem stops growing and a little bud scar forms. And then that's where it will start growing again.
Can you send me a picture of that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll put that bit online because that would be cool because anyone could count then how old this tree is. It'd be a cool little trick.
Yeah. And so we're both educators and we both take the students to ecology camp. And one of the things I've had the students do at our ecology camp is count those bud scars.
Right. Oh, cool.
Yeah.
What else are you finding when you're Sherlocking Holmes, how long a fire has gone through?
So it's how tall the plants are, if they've started reproducing or not, so if there's still like dead sticks around. I look at the trees, if I can see scorch marks and how fresh the scorch might be.
Are you relatively accurate for like say 0 to 10 years, or can you go back to be like, oh, this has been like 50 years?
It's
I can imagine like the longer it's a lot harder.
yeah. So 0 to 10, 0 to 8, maybe you can get it to the exact year. Then you're starting to go into buckets, right? Oh, maybe it's 8 to 10, 10 to 15. And then if it hasn't burned in a long time, you can tell, like, but you don't, I'd be impressed if somebody could tell you 40 versus 50 or 35 versus 50. Like it's
Right. Okay.
Once you're out that side, like it's, I would think it would be more difficult.
Yeah. I listened to another podcast called Hamish and Andy, and they have like special guests that come on. They've like, they've got special skills and they test it. Yours would be a good one for that.
Oh yeah.
It'd be an interesting one. So you also go into recently burnt places.
Yeah.
Very easy to tell when a fire's just gone through. You're looking at the succession of plants
That's right.
in there. What are you seeing? And well, firstly, how do you do that? And what are you seeing? And what are the changes, or what are the steps in process through after a fire's gone through?
Yeah. So a lot of my research has been in partnership with our state government. And so we have done projects trying to determine just what you're asking me. What is the appropriate interval for plant species in a particular vegetation type, ecosystem type? And so we'll go out and select sites, measure them, then they'll get burnt, and then we return. And we return immediately afterwards, and then a few months in the first spring, and then the next spring, and the spring after that, to sort of track what's happening. And what do we see? We see things like resprouting just out of the ground, like out of a stump, or little what we call epicormic resprouts that come out of the side of a trunk of a tree.
So that's what. So when a fire's gone through, you just see like the trees just turn like just fully green.
Yeah.
Like they're not like not just the leaves, like the whole tree, the trunk and everything. So that's the episodic growth.
Yep.
Yep.
All that epicormic regrowth.
Why does it do that?
So the trees, it's a great adaptation. So what they do is they have their bark. The bark protects the plant, and beneath that bark they have little buds. And so the buds, in deep evolutionary time would have been associated with where the branches came out, right? So you have to, like, a tree's growing and then it branches, and that branch comes initially from a bud that would push out. But also they have other buds that they don't use, and they're protected underneath the bark. But then when a fire comes through and takes off the top of the tree, all the sort of hormone regulation and stuff that would have prevented that bud from doing anything is released, and suddenly that bud starts to grow. And so it just will punch through the bark, and then it begins to put on leaves, and that's what we see.
Right. Huh.
It's really cool.
Yeah, that is. It's like, because you don't see it. Like they don't grow randomly. Like you don't, when a bushland hasn't had a fire go through, you don't see that growth. Right. It's only after a fire.
That's right.
Is there certain plants that, like, we've talked about succession in a couple other podcasts, but there's certain plants that come straight, like first pioneers, and then I think they're called, and then second settlers, or however it works.
Well, I think that's another thing that makes Australia in general really special. And I think our, southwestern Australia is like kind of sits at the front of that. Maybe I'm biased, but we have our systems are such that most of the plants we have are present almost immediately after fire. Now, a few will disappear and leave seeds behind, but that's what we call initial floristics. It's a terminology, but it means that most of the plants are there right away. Whereas in other parts of the world, say like in the high latitudes in the boreal forests, it goes through a much more sequential thing where the trees get killed by fire. The trees are not there right away necessarily, or there might be a few, but you go through really distinct stages of succession of different vegetation types. It might be mossy, and then a little bit of shrubs, then some small deciduous trees, and then the conifers. Mm-hmm. Whereas here, our trees often resprout, so they just stay. And then the shrubs and stuff also resprout, or they start growing from seed right away. And then you have a few things that are in the seed bank that come in, grow very quickly. and then they may go away again, but leave their seeds behind. So, but they don't need to colonize from outside necessarily,
Right.
or a smaller fraction of them do.
Right. Because you sort of see like after a fire, the first few years, the bush then gets really thick.
Yes.
And then it thins out once
That's
it
right.
gets older.
That's right.
Is that because of like when the canopies comes back, it sort of shades the.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And so over, that first, by the time you get to 2 or 3 years, it is starting to get a little bit thick.
Mm.
And then up to 10, 12, 15 years, it can stay thick. And then some of those plants that have come in right away, like acacias or some of the other legumes, they'll begin to senesce and leave their seeds behind. And then you can walk through it again.
Mm.
And I'll just mention, like, that observation is a hugely important one because it helps us understand, it ties together the ecology of the plants and the fuels and the fire risk. Because if it's dense, there's more stuff to burn, right? If it's open, that means you've changed the spatial configuration of all the biomass, right? So maybe there's a little bit more litter on the ground. That stuff's gone away, and you've got maybe bigger plants, but fewer of them. And that means there's more spacing between them. And so that observation is right at the nexus of a big controversy we're in right now here in Western Australia about how often to burn. Some people claim if you burn frequently, all you do is produce dense bush. Other people are of the view, well, the green stuff, it's not as important as the leaf litter, which does accumulate over time to some degree. And so we need to burn more frequently to control that leaf litter. So it's pretty nuanced. We could talk about maybe in depth in another time, but like that's a very active controversy right now because it has direct implications for what, quote unquote, correct fire risk management looks like.
Right. What's your gut feeling on that? What would you say?
The relatively unsatisfying answer is that both sides are right.
Right.
And
okay.
that you do have that densification. I completely, like, that's an ecological truth.
Yeah.
It is also a fair observation that leaf litter matters for spreading fire.
Yeah.
And it is also true that in the first few years after fire, there's not very much dead material around. And so and it's mostly green. And when it's green, it's full of water a lot of the year. And that means it's not very flammable. So that there is a truth that more frequent fire does decrease. It increases the fraction of the landscape that is not going to be flammable in any given year. But it comes back to that just really annoying phrase of like, well, it depends what your goals are.
Yeah.
So around some places where we have homes or valuable infrastructure, yeah, we're probably going to burn it more frequently. But for places that are really far away from human habitation, that's the place maybe where there's a need, value in having a conversation about, well, maybe not as frequently. And then when you layer on some of the issues around climate change and drying and warming, then that's where there's a lot of complexity. And
I was just going to ask
tricky.
about that because it's kind of like, in a way, it's obvious with a drying climate, it's going to be more risk for fires.
Yep.
Yeah, that's obviously not a good thing. Depends. All depends in a way, I guess. Yeah. Is that some of the issues that we're seeing? Well, would that be one of the bigger issues for, like, I'm going to just sort of focus on the Australian bushland, is the frequency and intensity of fires from climate change, or is it more I guess it's a combination of everything with like the lack of water for a lot of these plants?
Yeah, good question.
What would come first, really?
I think I take the perspective over multiple fire cycles. So that means, in my mind, I'm thinking about how the drying impacts both susceptibility, and capacity to recover. So, for example, in Australia or in Western Australia, we recently, the federal government recently listed our peats, our organic soils, as a threatened ecological community.
Mm.
And the reason they were listed as a threatened ecological community is because of climate change and because of fire catching those peats on. They start burning and then they don't stop burning, just like the root you were talking about on your farm. So what's happened is that in the past, it was wet enough that you could have a bushfire move through. It would actually burn the vegetation off the top of these peats, but the soil would not catch on fire because it was wet. It was sufficiently wet. And the amount of time, part of the year where it could have burned, or the number of years in which these things could have burned, was relatively small enough that the risk was low. Now we're seeing situations where those peats are drier, they're more susceptible to catching on fire, and it's happening. And the fire management is part of the issue in the sense that prescribed burns are the agent that is catching some of these peats on fire. And so that's been a huge debate in the community in the southern part of our state.
Can you explain to me what a peat is? Because I'm like trying to picture it in my head.
Absolutely. I'm still learning myself. So what is a peat? A peat is a place where what's happened is you've had over time a lot of leaf litter and organic stuff accumulate. Like it's usually in a low spot or in a streamline. And it's wet. And because it's wet, it's anoxic. And so that stuff accumulates and it basically forms like a real sort of, when you walk on this stuff, it's very bouncy. It's kind of rubbery under your feet, not solid like dirt. And so what happens is you get this really thick organic stuff forming, and then it kind of just keeps accreting, and you can get meters of it. And then there's certain plants that can grow in that material, and it stays.
I've been measured. It's full of organics and nutrients.
It's super full of organics. It can behave like, and when you expose it to air, it can be turned very acidic in times. But
that's not good for plants.
That's not good. But in its fully wetted up state, there's a small set of plants that grow very well in it, and it also acts like a huge sponge. So usually they're in streamlines, and so that means when they're full of water, those streams are often flowing much longer, or they're holding water in that catchment for a larger part of the year. But then when they start to dry out and degrade, then you can kind of go the other direction where it just becomes like this just dry organic stuff that any plant is going to absolutely struggle with because it's just there's not much there for it.
And also a big fuel source if it dries out.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And then you can see stuff burning down tens of centimeters into the soil. And you see stuff that plants that, were at the soil surface, but now they're at a pedestal that's like 10, 20, 30 centimeters in air because it's burned down that much or more. Yeah. So it can be really dramatic if these things catch on fire, unfortunately.
But they've listed them as a risk. So they obviously got a huge importance too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of species that are endemic to where these peats are because that's the only place they grow.
Right. What are these species and where are these peats mainly?
The species are things like some of our there are
orchids.
I'm not sure about orchids. There's something in the kangaroo paw family, something called a Hemodorum, but there's something called Impedisma, which is like a rush. It's like a little scraggly rush thing. There's a large shrub called that's in our eucalypt family called a Homolospermum that I think is mostly or only restricted to these places. And there'd be a few others that there's our Albany pitcher plant is largely restricted to peats. Not entirely, but largely.
Where are these peat habitats?
Yeah. And they are in the south. Well, historically, they were right through Perth, right through our forests here in the Southwest. I would say now a lot of the peats that we had up around Perth have largely collapsed. Not wholly, but a lot of them have,
Mm-hmm.
because of drying and fire. And nowadays, and the ones that were listed are down on our south coast. So they're like Albany to Margaret River. So they're in these really wet, forested environments that have these streamlines that are kind of shrubby, heathy lines of vegetation. And in there, you have these peats. And so they're like headquartered around Walpole, effectively, where you get the most rain and you have the most gentle summers.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I reckon, well, that's where our family is. So
Yeah.
I'll have to have a look out for those.
And I should say that you get stuff in there like, well, I would say the poster child for the peats is a species called the sunset frog. And that is a frog that was only discovered in the 90s by a professor at ECU named Pierre Horwitz. And that species is something like, I'm not even going to get this right, like 12 million years old or some like it diverged from its closest relative a really long time ago.
Yeah.
And there's less than 30 populations known.
There's surely a lot of work being done on that frog, right? It's a frog. I've never heard of it.
It is an amazing looking animal. It is called a sunset frog because the underside is orange and blue.
Right.
So yeah, like bright metallic.
Great
blue.
colors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there is work being done on it. It has been something that has been very difficult to instigate, and it is the difficulty has in part been to the politics of fire management.
Oh, that's good. I think.
Well, we are in a very difficult, and I think this is true. I'm not no matter where you are, but when a government has been doing something a certain way for many, many decades, the idea of change or altering course due to climate change or other factors can be difficult. And part of that difficulty can also be in endorsing research that might introduce information into this community that might run contrary to practice.
Okay. Yeah,
it's tricky. It's a tricky space. And so, and inevitably the sort of outcome of this stuff should always be, well, this is my opinion, but should always be one where we can understand something in terms of the biology and the ecology of an animal or an ecosystem. And it also yields some insights into how practice can change and adapt, because the inevitability is that it's never black or white. So burning's bad, burning's good. No, it's about practice. It's about the implementation and the details, the nuance. So maybe burning practices can evolve. And so
we're talking about at the start of the podcast about the fluidity.
That's right.
That's like, for me, that struck me as that's probably the most sensible way to go, and like working in that space and that connection with Indigenous and how that their fire practices worked. And so hopefully there's the steps forwards in that. I'm going to change subject a little bit here because you do have such an interesting background, and I know we could literally talk for hours about your stories. If anyone, or when you're listening, could probably tell that your accent isn't originally from here.
Correct.
Depending on what stories you want to share, but I know there's a few of them of your field work. You've been out through different forests in America, and you were even telling me that you went away on field work where it was like a 7-day hike from the car to get to these fieldwork sites. Like that's like insane. Like I thought I was going to really remote places, but like my hike was like maybe 20 Ks, but you're going like 7 days to get to a field site, which is incredible. you've also got a story about a bear. Can you elaborate on?
Sure. I would say I've been very lucky, and one of the aspects of I'm from California originally, but I did all my education in different parts of the United States, and part of the system there is that there's a real summer field season, and lots of people are going out, and they always need help, and it might mean volunteers, might mean technicians, and it's definitely how I got going on this, whatever path I've been on, trajectory, arc, whatever we want to call it. And one of the best jobs I think I ever had was working on frogs and fish in the Sierra Nevada of California. And it included working in a place called Sequoia Kings National Park, but also in as well as Yosemite National Park, which people might be more familiar with. In those parks and in California, there are bears. And I am never ceases to crack me up how afraid Australians are of bears. It seems like it's the one thing that Australians are the most afraid of. Bears. You saw a bear? Oh my God.
Well, I definitely feel like that. Yeah. Yeah.
So these parks have bears in them, and sometimes, and in the past, the bears understood that humans equaled food. So like if you go back decades and decades, like they used to feed in the tip, and that was true in Yellowstone as well as Yosemite and Sequoia Kings. And over time, park staff, to their credit, have recognized that that's not great. And they've instituted regulations and slowly tried to control that. So anyway, working in these places, you have to carry some gear that is meant to prevent the bear from getting in your stuff. Generally, it's not a problem, but sometimes you get the odd one that's habituated, and then it becomes a problem. And I did get unlucky one time where we had come in at night and were camped out only a few miles from the trailhead because we had gotten a late start. And we knew there was a bear in the area and had done what we could, but we had these sacks that were kind of made of like a Kevlar material to prevent the bear from tearing it open. But it didn't mean that it couldn't
smash everything.
Yeah, chew on it a little bit. But anyway, so we put a couple bags in the tree tied to each other over a branch. But it just wasn't high enough. We didn't have the right, our rope wasn't quite strong enough. And laid down in my sleeping bag, and then crash, snap. And then the bear had come and taken our food. And I was like, well, I don't want to be the biologist who gets in trouble, because then I'll look like a stupid idiot. So I sort of jumped out of my sleeping bag and sort of pulled up my pants, and grabbed my head torch in my hand and put my sandals on and ran off to this bear, yelling at it, because this is what you do. It's a black bear.
You chased a bear.
Yeah, I chased the bear. I chased the bear. So I continued to chase the bear for about half an hour.
Oh my God.
At which point I was keeping up with it because it had one bag in its mouth and the other bag was sort of tied and trailing, and it kept getting stuck between rocks and logs and shit. And so I was able to sort of keep up with it. And after 20, 30 minutes, I think it decided this guy's just crazy. So this isn't going to work out for me. It abandoned its effort, and I retrieved my food.
Oh my God.
Now completely crushed and bear saliva ridden.
So did the field trip continue?
We hiked out that night back to the car and then resupplied.
Yeah.
And
how long was the trip? How long were you planning to be out in the
that
field?
particular trip was 12 or 13 days.
Right. From a car.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. It makes for a heavy pack when you're carrying that much food at the outset. And we'd had our bigger containers that were hard plastic that we'd actually stashed somewhere else so that we could continue the trip. It might have been a 15-day trip, actually. But anyway, I think we were carrying probably 12 days of food, which is heavy.
Yeah. I did Outward Bound when I was younger, which we went, but we were only carrying food for a few days, and just remember, because it's water, Or did you have freshwater sources?
We did. We
Okay.
did. So that's one of the advantages of that particular place is that there is surface water. So you don't have to
Okay.
carry more than a few liters at a go. But
Yeah.
we had all of our like sampling equipment as well. So,
Yeah. That's to me. That's like the dream scenario of being able to go sampling in such remote, untouched places. Like,
that was fun.
is there like I'm sure you've done that a few times. Is there other stories? Not so much being chased by a bear, but like some of the cool things that you've got to do.
I think the act of getting to go to these remote places, and sometimes you're working hard, tired, it's a steep hill, you're in deep, thick shrubbery or whatever, but you just stop and you look around and like you are in these gorgeous, gorgeous places. And it's so rewarding. Like I've worked in Antarctica, and I did that. I just ran a water analyzing machine for 12 hours a day
I never knew that you went to Antarctica.
And
every time I speak to you, you seem to amaze me. You've done everything. You're a man that's done every.
But seeing penguins in their habitat, that's cool. And working in the Alpine of the Sierra, working, here in Australia where the plants and animals are just wild, and like you're bending over counting plants and then a echidna cruises by, like that's pretty cool, I must say. So yeah, I've count myself very lucky.
Yeah, definitely. Like I'm sure we could just keep talking for hours about that.
Probably could.
If you had unlimited funding and time, what is your dream project?
Oh, great question. I would say my dream project would be to create the knowledge and the tools that helped other people understand stuff better. So, for example, here in southwestern Australia, we have so much biodiversity, so much, and we know so little about it. If I had a magic wand, I would create beautiful field guides and natural history knowledge for every species that we have here. And I would give it to people for free. That would be my dream project. That's a total.
Sounds like an awesome project. Yeah.
Yeah. That would be my passion. Like, I love what I do, and how the evolution of technology is unlocking a lot of opportunities, but that's more mundane, and I probably will actually get real world funding for that. But my dream would be to have that ability to just create awesome content that would help people understand what they were looking at and would make them curious.
Cool. Yeah, I really hope that that starts and at least like a progression into something like that. Might not be every species, but in some way that'd be awesome. Are you working on something like that, or?
My dream would be to work on that for Banksia woodlands, which is the main vegetation type around Perth.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a friend who's working on a version of that for the Northern Jarrah Forest, which I think is it's a great template. So yeah.
You've just alluded to that you've worked in so many different environments. Pretty much every type of environment almost on Earth. Have you worked in the Sahara Desert or in deserts?
Have I done field work in the deserts? Almost. I've done some field work in the Sonoran Desert. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
In Arizona. Yeah.
They're definitely going to have you back on. Is there a least favorite bushland for you to work in?
Oh, least favorite. I'm still scared of leeches.
Really?
I don't think I like leeches.
They are a bit of a scary thing because it's like something that sucks onto you and drains your blood.
So like I haven't done much field work in like North Queensland, but like even
we got leeches here.
Yeah, we have a few here, but like walking down like a path at a little higher elevation in like North Queensland and just seeing dozens of leeches like reaching out off the vegetation, that's a little intimidating. That definitely is a little intimidating. But no, I think living in Australia, I've probably gotten a little soft on cold. so I'd probably be a little more scared of cold now than heat. But I'm up for it. I'm actually.
You definitely seem like you're up for anything.
I have the questionable attribute of enjoying discomfort.
Right. Yeah. I totally understand where you come from, because I'm starting on my career now, like wanting to go to those most remote places is generally because they are hard to get to. People haven't been there before because it's unenjoyable, but like that thrill of like, what is there, or like trying to get there, and like that thrill of being like, I'm surviving through this is like something different. It's like, so I totally understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.
This has been great. I'm so glad we've got to do this, and I know there's definitely going to be another one.
Yep.
At some stage. Won't be on chili sauce. But thank you so much for coming in, Joe.
Thank you, Kurt.
I really enjoyed this.
It was a pleasure.